Nicholson Baker needs no introduction. Usually I say that in these debates, it's a bluff on both sides, but in this case, it's not. He's one of America's most inventive, most daring of novelists and essayists whose books cover everything from phone sex to the American library system to the origins of the Second World War. But what makes him interesting for us is his new book, Baseless, which covers Nick's attempts over many years to extract secret classified memos from the CIA, from the American Air Force and other agencies, using American Freedom of Information legislation about the possible use by US forces of bacteriological weapons during the Korean War. It's a beautiful book. I've read it, here it is. To me, it's almost a model for a new kind of artful, novelistic approach to investigative reporting, which many of us can learn from. But can I start you off, Nick, just by asking you what set you off on this mission?
Well, first, James, that was a lovely thing to say. I wanted it to be a new kind of book, a new feeling, a new texture of investigations. So I'm just thrilled that you took it that way. What set me off, I guess, was a long time ago when I was writing about libraries, and I found that a certain group, a certain kind of, I guess you'd say an agitprop group in favor of microfilm had all these strange Cold War associations. And since I didn't know anything about the Cold War at the time, I had to follow back the biographies of all these people because they were all so interested in microfilm, and so it was a sort of a back way to get into it. And I read an interesting book by two Toronto historians about whether or not the United States had used biological weapons during the Korean War, and I was fascinated by it, and also fascinated by the negative reviews about it. And so over the past 15 years, I've been sort of learning about all this stuff, and I ended up interviewing these two Toronto historians, Edward Hagerman and Stephen Endicott, and I ended up with boxes of documents from their researches, and then I made my own research. I went to the National Archives and the Eisenhower Library and the Truman Library, and at some point you realize, by God, I've got to file some Freedom of Information Act requests, and that's a whole different order of things. I mean, it's not that that's not the first time I ever did it, because when I was writing the library book, I filed a FOIA for to the CIA for a person, and it was like 4 months later, this fat envelope came, and I thought, well, this is a good law, So, but what happened when I filed specific documents held in the National Archives, controlled by the Air Force, 4, 5, 6, 7 years went by, and I thought, this is not right. I'm not getting any response at all. So the book is about that feeling of sort of puzzled waiting. Why is this taking so long when we know the exact name and box number of the document? We're not talking about any mysterious thing. And that's what the book is about, is why.
You said 6, 7, 8 years. Many of us journalists work on a week-to-week basis. What's extraordinary about the book is your endurance, your stamina. How many years in total, or what year was your first request put in?
Well, the first request for things that related to this book, I guess, was 2012. I had asked for another document that took 4 years before that, so I knew it took a long time sometimes. But 2012, and then I got an email from the National Archives. These are all documents that are held in the beautiful, marvelous National Archives, wonderful, where they look over, they guard all the important stuff. But unfortunately, they are powerless to make a decision about what to release. They have to, when somebody says, I'd like to see this document that I know you have, they then have to go back to the originating agency let's say the Air Force or the Navy or the CIA or whoever it is, and say, can we release this document? And that agency then can take as long as it wants to. I am grateful to you for saying that I'm patient, but I am not as patient as some. And Ned Hagerman, who worked on the book originally, was still saying, yes, I would like you to continue my request after 10 years. I mean, there was recently, while I was working on the book, actually, there was a piece about the Freedom of Information Act, about some of the older requests. And this guy said, this request is old enough to rent a car. In the United States, you have to be over 25 to rent a car. These things sit around for a very long time, unless you're willing to sue. If you're willing to sue, then a different machinery kicks in. And that's the bizarre truth of it, is that it's all about lawsuits instead of about actual government agencies abiding by the law in advance of a lawsuit.
So given how hard it was to get all the information, or any information at all, and the number of redactions and the information that you did get, what do you conclude then about FOIA in general? I mean, do
I
you
think,
have any meta conclusions about what it is, whether it's worth the candle?
well, I think it's a great law. It's a beautiful law, and it's an idealistic law, and it says that we deserve to know, in fact, that we constitutionally have a right to know what our government is doing, because you can't have freedom of the press if the press has no ability to find out what actually happened. So it's actually a First Amendment question. So I like the law, and the law worked very, very well for a long time, but it has been gradually suppressed or ignored or distorted in various ways, and that's too bad. But the book is also about successes, the successes of people who were willing to wait and finally got things to happen, and the massive success actually of a small group in Cambridge called Muckrock, who sued the CIA and got an enormous kind of a midden mound of formerly declassified documents to be put up on the internet for the whole world to see. So and I learned a lot from those documents. So I think that it's I guess the situation is that you have to be willing to wait, and you have to be willing to suppress your kind of fierce little feelings of indignation that the law is being ignored, because eventually certain things come out. In my case, mysteriously, right when the book was going to press, I got an envelope from the National Archives with a completely declassified document. It was from 1949, so you think, well, of course it's, but no, it's a powerfully revealing document from the beginnings of the Cold War about a plan to deceive the Soviet Union and trick them into believing that the United States had a certain super bioweapon, and that would somehow distract the Soviet Union, and they would spend money on research that was not worth doing. So a terrible plan, because it started off a biological weapons arms race. And I have, for the first time, the ability to read this thing totally unredacted. It was so thoroughly redacted before that you can't even really understand what it was about. But now all the black is gone. So there are these sort of tiny moments where the cupboard doors open on governmental processes that make it all worthwhile.
And just for the sake of people who won't read the book, I hope they do. But your conclusion really is that this was as much a propaganda war as a bio war, then.
Well, it was both. I think that the United States had an enormous biological weapons development program. Were paying lots of scientists to figure out ways to kill people with germs, and they tried out something with the help of some Japanese germ scientists in 1950, and the communists said, the communists caught it and said, no, this is, you're doing this terrible thing. You've left behind terrible diseases when you retreated from North Korea. So that was true. But then there was a later effort by the United States that was, although there were some limited experiments in February of 1952, a lot of it was a kind of psyop. It was a kind of a way of dropping insects and spiders and all kinds of creepy stuff that fell from the sky, voles, I mean, which are little mice, but they weren't infected with anything. So it was just this insane plan.
And the detail in the book about all these frogs and whatever else falling from planes as part of a psyops exercise is incredible, and would make an amazing film.
It is so sad though that people in government agencies in Washington D.C. would be sitting around thinking, let's freak out the communists with a make them think that a terrible biological attack is happening, and yet we can deny it, and we can deny it completely and indignantly, which is what they did over and over again, because mostly it wasn't true in the second phase. So I think, yes, the United States used biological weapons in the Korean War, and that's horrifying. Even more horrifying is that they planned to use massive amounts of biological weapons in the coming war that they expected with the Soviet Union. So that's true, but in a particular question of whether they engaged in a large-scale bioweapons attack on China and North Korea in 1952, the answer is probably not. So, but I think that's interesting, is that sometimes that the conclusion that one comes to has to be, I mean, of course it has to be true, but it has to have the grit and the range and the messiness of actual truth, which is that there's not that things are not entirely, well, it's not a gigantic boss battle between the forces of evil and the forces of good. There's a lot of looking and poking and thinking that you have to do about the specifics of a given episode of history.
I couldn't agree more. Do you see that reflected in the American press contemporarily, and Manichaean fairy stories about good and evil?
I do, because I think that we entered a surreal phase, that we're in you cannot say certain things, and I wrote a book that is filled with laboratory accidents, and right now we are in the middle of what may be the outcome of a laboratory accident. I mean, it's at least worth asking whether, if you have a gigantic building filled with samples of very exotic bat diseases, and a very exotic bat-related disease breaks out in that city thousands of miles away from where the bats are, whether that might be possible that one is related to the other. But it is actually taboo right now to ask the question, to say, as a scientist, proximity is an important piece of evidence. It's so strange. So we're watching something happen that in the United States that is pathological. The public discourse has become so distorted by the hatred that both sides have for each other that we've lost the ability to try to come to some sort of communal understanding of what actually happened, and not to demonize any countries, but to simply find out why we're in the middle of this worldwide disease. Yeah. So yes, I do think we're in a very weird time, but we're not one of the things that I felt in writing this book is the rhetoric is very disturbing now, but the 1950s were so destructive. And Harry Truman, actually, if you want to look at a president, he was kind of funny and folksy and everything, but he was a tremendous bigot. And he authorized Hiroshima and Nagasaki and massive biological investigations that led to outbreaks. And he was a terrible, terrible president. So we are lucky in some strange way that we live in 2020, because even though you tune into the YouTube and watch some clip from a State Department meeting or from presidential something or other, and you think, my God, this is just unthinkably awful. Fewer people are dying. I mean, in a basic way, the firebombing of North Korea, the firebombing of Vietnam, the firebombing of Japan, none of that is happening right now. We're doing better, even though the rhetoric is stranger.
And so the book is really a work of art, but you do have some concrete policy solutions towards the end. Or maybe you could just list those policy recommendations for us.
Well, look, I think it's worth saying that if a top secret, super embarrassing, juicy fact about a government gets old, things change, and we ought to know even if you accept the fact that people need to have secrets for a while, they don't need to be perma secrets. So what I proposed was that I would propose this to the whole world, actually, but I propose this for the United States, that any document that is older than 50 years should be declassified in its entirety without redactions. Because, well, heck, the government did this in our name, made these decisions. Sometimes they were very momentous decisions, and we need to know what they were. And so I thought that was a simple ask. Anything over than 50 years, we want to be able to read it. If it sits in a file box somewhere, you can't say that national security right now is threatened by this 50-year-old thing. Now, the documents that I was looking for were 65, 70 years old. And there are still documents from many thousands of documents from World War II that are kept secret. And in Britain, older documents that are older still. But somewhere along the way, somebody has to say, let's draw a line, a moving forward line, like the copyright laws. The copyright law moves forward each year. He says anything before this year is public domain. Well, we want something similar to that in the world of freedom of information. Anything before this act should be freely readable by any person who has a curiosity to read it. That's the ask.
Did you get any feedback from your ask?
No, but I think a book when a book comes out, there's a sort of period, which I think I'm in right now, in which things simmer. And then I'm also hoping that my other big idea was I would like to sue the government for that particular body of documentation. Say anything older than 50 years should be, that's in the National Archives even. Let's make it simple. Anything that's in that building should be readable by the public, anything older than 50 years. Just sue them for it. Well, I don't have money to sue them. You have to, it's complicated. It takes over your life. It's expensive. So one of the things I thought by putting the book out there was to say, here's a whole bunch of stuff that you can think about. And then maybe a lawyer, another kind of person, more excited by lawsuits than I am, I guess, would do it. So that's the stage we're at, the sort of simmering stage, I hope.
Well, let's hope some lawyers are listening. Thank you very much, Nick. We're really grateful for your time. Please do buy Baseless. It's a fantastic book, both for readers and investigative journalists, of which you are now one, Nick. So thank you.
Thank you, James. I was so glad that you asked me to talk, and I'm talking, and thanks a lot.